Why do we feel so empty in a world full of solutions? You have a job, you've set goals, maybe you've even hit some of them. Your calendar is full, your shelves hold self-help books and half-used gratitude journals. You've been told you're doing well. But in the quiet moments, when the noise dies down, something inside still aches, something unnamed, unaddressed, something raw. The culture most of us grew up in has an answer for that kind of pain. Take something, fix it, make it go away. From a young age, we're trained to believe that unpleasant feelings are problems, symptoms of a chemical imbalance or a broken mindset. Sad, anxious, numb. There's a product for that, a pill, a podcast, a plan. Just keep moving, keep optimizing, keep grinding forward. But what if the real problem isn't that you're feeling too much? What if it's that you're not allowed to feel at all? Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, a leading psychiatrist and trauma researcher, spent decades inside this system. He began his work at the VA, treating veterans who had seen and survived the unimaginable. Naturally, he turned to what he had been trained to trust: medication, antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac and Zoloft. He helped lead the first clinical trials of these medications for PTSD, and what he found surprised him. They didn't work, not well, and not consistently, not for the kind of deep embodied suffering that trauma leaves behind. If it doesn't work, he thought, let's see what else could work. That single question became the beginning of a lifelong search. A search not just for better treatments, but for a completely different way of thinking about trauma, healing, and the human experience. Because trauma is not just a memory, it's a wound that doesn't stay in your head, but lives in your nervous system, in your gut, in your reactions, in the way your body flinches before your brain can even catch up. And trying to erase that with a pill is like painting over rust. You might cover it, but it's still eating away underneath. This script, this journey, isn't just about trauma. It's about the bigger question that trauma reveals. What does it take to feel whole again? And maybe even more important, what if wholeness doesn't mean forgetting, but learning how to carry the memory differently? Before we get into the brain scans, the therapies, and the surprising science, we need to ask something much simpler. What loop are you caught in? Is it the loop of productivity, the loop of escape, the loop of pretending everything's fine because it has to be? If you're tired of treating symptoms and ready to face what lies beneath, not with fear, but with curiosity, then keep going. This is not a story of quick fixes. It's a story of return, of reconnection, of coming back to yourself, even if you've been away a long time. Most people think of trauma as something that happened a long time ago: a car crash, a war, an abusive parent, a sudden loss. They picture trauma like a book on a shelf, a bad chapter they've closed and moved on from. But what if trauma isn't about the past at all? What if it's about the way your body remembers, even when your mind tries to forget? According to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, trauma doesn't live in the story you tell. It lives in your nervous system, in the tension in your shoulders, in the breath you hold without knowing, in the way your heart rate spikes when a voice sharpens, even if no threat is there. This is what he calls the survival brain, the part of you that doesn't wait for facts, the part that doesn't care about logic. Its job is not to think, it's to detect danger instantly. When something terrifying happens, a betrayal, a violation, a sudden loss of control, this survival brain takes over. It doesn't just record the event like a video, it records how your body felt at that moment: frozen, panicked, powerless, hyper-alert. And long after the event is over, that response keeps playing, not because you're weak, but because your body is trying to protect you from it happening again. So you may live in a safe home now. You may be far from the battlefield, the breakup, or the childhood bedroom. But your body doesn't know that. You flinch when a door slams. You shut down during conflict. You avoid certain smells, sounds, places, and you don't even know why. You're not broken. You're adapting. This is why trauma survivors often feel trapped in their own skin. Because the story might be over, but the alarm system never got the message. And here's the catch. You can't think your way out of this. Cognitive strategies, reframing, positive thinking, even talk therapy can only go so far if your body still feels unsafe. So the real question becomes, how do you help someone feel safe again, not just in their mind, but in their body? How do you calm a nervous system that's been trained to expect the worst? How do you live with the memories without being owned by them? This is where the conventional system often fails. You can't medicate away a body memory. You can't suppress a flinch reflex with logic. You can't silence shame with affirmations. Because trauma is not a bad feeling, it's a physiological reality, stored, replayed, and reactivated through the body. To heal then, we have to stop asking only, "What happened to you?" and start asking, "How is it still living in you?" In the next section, we'll dive into a treatment that defies conventional logic, and yet may hold one of the keys to calming that survival brain. A technique that involves no pills, no machines, just your eyes, your breath, and a willingness to remember. Let me know when you'd like to continue with Section 3, The Door Opens, EMDR, and the Challenge to Logic. You said, yes, ChatGPT said, great. Here is Section 3, The Door Opens, EMDR, and the Challenge to Logic. This section introduces the first major breakthrough Dr. Kolk experienced beyond medication, a surprising, unconventional method. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Healing rarely announces itself in a language we expect. Sometimes it comes disguised as nonsense. That's how it began with EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. When Dr. Bessel Kolk first heard about it, his reaction was blunt. This is crazy nonsense. The method was simple, laughably simple to many professionals. You ask a person to bring up a traumatic memory, not just the image, but the feelings, the body sensations, the sounds, and then you ask them to move their eyes side to side, following a therapist's fingers. That's it. No drugs, no analysis, just memory and motion. For a man trained in hard science and clinical data, this felt absurd. How could wiggling your fingers in front of someone's face possibly help them process trauma? How could eye movements compare to medication or deep psychoanalysis? But then he saw the results. Not once, not twice, but again and again. Patients who had been locked in decades of trauma loops began to shift, gently, gradually, but unmistakably. Memories that had held them hostage began to feel distant, even manageable. They were no longer overwhelmed. They were observers, not prisoners. They'd say things like, "Yes, that happened to me, but it's not happening now. I can finally think about it without falling apart. It feels like it belongs to the past, not the present." That was the moment the door cracked open. EMDR, it turns out, does something profound beneath the surface. While the science is still being explored, what we know is this. The eye movements seem to activate bilateral brain stimulation, engaging both hemispheres. This may allow the brain to reprocess stuck traumatic material and integrate it, much like how the brain consolidates memory during REM sleep. In simpler terms, EMDR helps the brain digest what it couldn't process in the moment of trauma. It's not erasure, it's reorientation, helping the nervous system realize this is not happening anymore. That's the key. Because trauma doesn't just make you remember what happened, it tricks your body into thinking it's still happening, over and over again. EMDR breaks that cycle, not by changing the story, but by changing your relationship to the story. For van der Kolk, this was the first time he saw a non-conventional technique change a person's inner circuitry, not just temporarily soothe it. It was also the first time he realized something deeper. Maybe healing doesn't have to make logical sense to be real. This was a turning point. From this moment on, he stopped asking, "What is the official method?" and started asking, "What actually helps people feel safe in their bodies again?" What came next was even more radical, not a treatment based on technology or even on the brain at all, but on something far older and closer to home, the body itself. After witnessing the strange effectiveness of EMDR, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk began asking a different kind of question. What if the body isn't just where trauma lives, but also where healing begins? For centuries, Western medicine treated the body as a machine, something to be diagnosed, managed, medicated. The mind, especially in psychiatry, was considered the driver of everything: logic over emotion, thought over feeling, cognition over sensation. But trauma doesn't follow that logic. Trauma is messy. It bypasses reason, and it roots itself stubbornly in the felt experience of being alive, especially when being alive didn't feel safe. So van der Kolk began turning to practices that most psychiatrists never considered clinical. One of the first was yoga, not yoga as exercise or a trendy escape from stress, but yoga as a discipline of returning to the body, to breath, to stillness, to presence. He and his team studied the effects of trauma-informed yoga on PTSD. The results were astonishing. People who couldn't sit through a talk therapy session without shutting down were suddenly able to stay in their bodies, to breathe through discomfort, to notice what sensations arose and stay with them, not run from them, not suppress them. Yoga helped them reclaim ownership over their physical selves. Because here's the hard truth: after trauma, your body often doesn't feel like home. It feels like a trap, a reminder, a war zone. But through breathwork, movement, and mindful awareness, survivors could begin to rebuild a relationship with their internal experience, gently, over time. And it wasn't just yoga. Next came something even more unexpected: theatre. In the Berkshires, van der Kolk became involved with a program called Shakespeare in the Courts. The idea was wild. Local juvenile offenders weren't sentenced to jail time. They were sentenced to become Shakespearean actors. At first glance, this might seem like a joke, but something powerful happened on those stages. Teenagers, many of whom had lived through violence, abandonment, and generational trauma, stepped into roles where they could express rage, grief, power, love, all the human experiences they'd never been allowed to explore safely. In playing kings, warriors, fools, and lovers, they began to understand something vital. Their bodies could feel different depending on the role they played. Their voices could grow strong. Their posture could expand. They could inhabit courage, dignity, even vulnerability, not as a lecture, but as a lived experience. And when you embody something, even pretend, the body doesn't always know it's pretend. It learns, it adapts, it remembers. This is the essence of what trauma-informed movement can do. It creates new internal references. I can feel powerful, I can feel expressive, I can take up space. It teaches, not through talking, but through doing. Healing doesn't always begin with the question, "What happened to you?" Sometimes it begins with, "Can you move your body this way? Can you breathe into this shape? Can you imagine yourself differently, even for a moment?" When trauma disconnects us from ourselves, we don't always need more explanations. Sometimes we just need a way back in. And with practices like yoga and theatre, that way begins, not through the intellect, but through sensation, expression, and presence. Up next, a deeper dive into the brain itself and how new technologies are helping trauma survivors reshape their mental patterns from the inside out. Not so long ago, people believed the brain was static, that once it developed, and especially once it was damaged, you were stuck with what you had. But trauma research has helped shatter that myth. What we now know is this: the brain is plastic. It adapts, it rewires, it learns. And just like trauma can rewire it toward fear, tension, and overreaction, healing experiences can rewire it the other way. This is where neurofeedback comes in. Imagine this: you sit in a chair. Sensors are gently placed on your scalp. They're not injecting anything into your brain. They're just reading your brainwaves. You're watching a screen, maybe a video game or a movie, and as your brain enters healthier, more balanced states, the system gives you subtle feedback, a reward, a shift in brightness, a sound cue. Nothing intrusive, just a nudge. Over time, your brain starts to learn, oh, this feels better. This calm state gets reinforced. I can stay here longer. And what was once a pattern of hypervigilance, of shutdown, of internal chaos, slowly begins to reorganize. Dr. van der Kolk began exploring neurofeedback with trauma survivors who hadn't responded well to other methods. What he saw surprised him. People who had lived most of their lives in overdrive, constantly scanning for threats, reacting to shadows, began to find stillness. Others, who had long felt numb or dissociated, began to feel present again, grounded in their own bodies and minds. Neurofeedback doesn't erase the past, but it helps the brain build a new present, one not dictated by reflexive fear. And what's profound is that it works without language. You don't have to tell your story. You don't have to relive the worst moments of your life. Your brain simply learns, through practice and reward, how to function differently. To many trauma survivors, this is revolutionary. Because after trauma, it's easy to believe you're damaged, that your reactions are your identity, that the way your brain responds to the world is set in stone. But neurofeedback reminds us, you're not broken, you're patterned, and patterns can change. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, patience, and repetition. But slowly, the old grooves, those default settings shaped by trauma, begin to soften. New connections form, new responses emerge. And for the first time, some people get to feel what calm actually is, not just as a concept, but as a lived state of being. This kind of inner reorganization is more than a medical process. It's a form of freedom. Freedom from cycles you didn't choose. Freedom from reactions you never understood. Freedom from a nervous system that once felt like a prison. It's one more reminder that healing doesn't always come from confronting the trauma head-on. Sometimes it comes from giving your brain the space and support it needs to discover. I don't have to live in defense mode anymore. Next, we move from subtle brain shifts to one of the most controversial and now most promising approaches in trauma therapy: psychedelics. For decades, psychedelics were the taboo of psychiatry, discarded, ridiculed, and buried under decades of political fear and cultural panic. But science, like healing, has a way of circling back to what was once dismissed. When two researchers approached Dr. Bessel van der Kolk nearly 15 years ago, they didn't come with credentials or clinical charts. They came with a question: do you think psychedelics could help with trauma? Van der Kolk's response was part caution, part curiosity. He remembered the 1960s, the wild experimentation, the mind-opening experiences, the collapse of public trust. He warned them, don't do it. It'll destroy your careers. These substances are illegal. But he also couldn't deny the pull, the possibility that there was something powerful here, something untapped. After all, traditional treatments weren't working. People were still stuck, still suffering, still dissociating from their lives. The researchers went forward anyway. They got the approvals. They raised the funding, and they launched what would become one of the most rigorous and influential studies ever conducted on MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. And what they found was nothing short of extraordinary. MDMA, also known as ecstasy or Molly, is not a party drug in this context. In a clinical setting, under controlled supervision, it becomes something entirely different, a tool for radical self-connection. Here's how a typical session unfolds. A patient arrives after weeks of preparation with trained therapists. They lie on a comfortable bed. They take a carefully measured dose of MDMA. They wear an eye mask. Music plays gently in the background. And for the next 8 hours, 2 therapists sit with them, guiding, witnessing, never interfering. And then something opens. People revisit the darkest moments of their lives, but without the terror. Instead of being overwhelmed by shame, fear, or numbness, they are met with something almost impossible for trauma survivors to access: compassion, not just from the therapists, from themselves. They begin to see that they were not weak, or broken, or deserving of what happened. They begin to understand that the choices they made to survive, to shut down, to lash out, to run, were not flaws. They were adaptations. MDMA does not erase memory. It softens fear. It lowers the defenses just enough to let people look inward, not as enemies, but as caretakers. And the results were undeniable. Measures of PTSD severity dropped dramatically, often more than with any other treatment van der Kolk had ever studied. People who had been stuck in cycles of self-hatred and avoidance began to say things like, "I can finally see myself without disgust. What happened to me is part of my story, but it's not all of me. I finally feel free." This doesn't mean MDMA is a magic cure. The therapy requires structure, skilled support, and deep integration afterward. It's not for everyone, but it challenges everything we thought we knew about what healing could look like. It suggests that sometimes we need a gentle nudge beyond our ordinary consciousness to see ourselves clearly. That the mind, when safely expanded, can become a mirror, not of what went wrong, but of what might still be whole. For van der Kolk, this was one of the most hopeful discoveries in decades. But even here, he returns to a simple truth. One size doesn't fit all. Not everyone needs MDMA. Not everyone responds to neurofeedback, yoga, EMDR, or any single method. But every person deserves a path that fits their nervous system, their story, and their needs. And finding that path, that's the final, most human experiment of all. Next, we'll bring it all together. What it means to heal in a world that still doesn't fully understand trauma, and how the real goal may not be erasing the past, but learning to live with it differently. If there's one lesson that emerges from all this, from the scans, the therapies, the experiments, the stories, it's this: there is no single cure for trauma. There is no 5-step formula, no universal fix. There is only the slow, courageous, deeply personal act of reclaiming your life, piece by piece. That may sound disappointing at first. We've been conditioned to crave quick fixes. We want a pill that erases pain, a method that guarantees peace. But trauma doesn't work that way, because trauma is not a malfunction. It's a survival imprint. It's the body saying, "I'm still here, still guarding, still remembering." Healing, then, isn't about erasing that memory. It's about changing the relationship to it. As Dr. van der Kolk has said many times, trauma isn't just an event that took place in the past. It's also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. That imprint doesn't go away with logic. It doesn't always respond to medication. But it can shift with presence, with movement, with compassion, with the right support at the right time. It can shift when a person finally says, "Yes, this happened to me," and "No, it doesn't define me." It can shift when the nervous system, after years of false alarms, begins to believe, maybe I'm safe now. And that belief, that fragile, powerful relearning, becomes the foundation of everything. What makes this process so deeply human is how non-linear it is. You might find progress through EMDR and then plateau. You might feel nothing during yoga for weeks and then suddenly sob in child's pose. You might try MDMA-assisted therapy and touch a part of yourself you thought was gone forever. Then you return to the world, to the grocery store, to emails, to the mirror, and things don't feel perfect, but they feel possible. That is healing. Not the absence of pain, but the return of choice. The ability to say, I'm allowed to feel this. I can stay in my body. I'm not afraid of myself anymore. Van der Kolk's work reminds us that science can serve the soul if we let it, that the brain and body are not separate from who we are, but vital maps of where we've been and where we might go next. More importantly, it reminds us of something our culture often forgets. The goal isn't to be normal. The goal is to be whole. Wholeness means being able to carry both joy and pain, memory and movement, stillness and story. It means honoring the survival mechanisms that got you here, while gently asking them to step aside when they're no longer needed. For some, that journey begins with stillness. For others, with movement. For others still, with psychedelics, sound therapy, neurofeedback, or creative expression. But for all of us, the question is the same. How can I live in this body, this life, and feel like it belongs to me again? That is not a clinical question. It is a human one. And perhaps in the end, that's what trauma healing is. Not a science experiment, not a diagnosis, but a return, not to who you were, but to who you are underneath the wound. Closing invitation. If any part of this resonated, if you've ever felt like your reactions don't make sense, like your past won't stay in the past, or like you're somehow too much, you're not alone. You're not broken. You are a body that remembers, and you deserve a future that feels safe, real, and entirely your own. This is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a different one, a story where healing doesn't mean forgetting, but remembering with compassion.